Thanks, Christian. So I know this is the last session. I'm sorry to have you stay here just for me. I'll try to keep this relatively short and hopefully entertaining or interesting. First, who am I? So Vincent Untz, this is my picture. Hopefully I still look like that. I've been working in the open source community for more than 20 years now, initially more in the Linux desktop world for 10 years or so, and then I went to work on the cloud technologies. I took a small break, 2 years out of the open source world. It was interesting, learned a lot of new things, but I realized that I missed open source, and I had the opportunity to join Centreon last year, which was actually very positive. Bit of a relief also for me, because I was glad to come back to this. And what is Centreon? So Centreon is a solution that can be used to monitor services, hosts, and so on. It's used all over the world. It's probably being used to monitor like millions of services and so on. But it's built on a solution that is open source, that looks like this. You can have like 2 screenshots. It's developed on GitHub openly, of course. And this is something that was created like 18 years ago, the company, but the project itself was created like 20 years ago by 2 students, Julien and Romain. And like open source back then was just obvious for them. So that's how it started, and they decided to make a business out of it because they had fun with it. And I mean, in the long story of Centreon, I'm not the best one to tell about it, but there's a lot of typical open source things like license change, contributors license agreement, forks, and so on. But this is for another discussion. So Centreon is open source. Julien and Romain, they started that. They had no idea how to do business initially, like they were students, you know. And the first thing that most people do when they start a business, they just wonder how they make money. So they tried several things. Initially, they started to just sell services around the solution that they developed openly, like a lot of companies. After a few years, they realized that when they were going to see a prospect, they were actually not the only ones trying to sell Centreon. They were facing some competition for services, and they were like, why are we losing on our own solution? That makes no sense. So they went to change the business model, and Centreon the company became a software vendor. And in that transition, they decided to move also to an open core business. So the solution has still the open source core that is really the most out of the solution, and there's a tiny bit on top of it to help things for visualization and so on that provides extra value for customers. And 3-4 years ago, the idea was that it makes sense to move to SaaS. So SaaS is a big change, a big shift in the whole industry. And if you look in details, actually, every kind of software is slowly moving to SaaS. It's very surprising. And when people initially think like business would not move that part of the infrastructure to SaaS, well, a few years later it happens. So why not for monitoring? And that's actually one of the reasons I joined Centreon. So open source was obviously one reason. The other one was SaaS, because I really thought a lot about SaaS. I care a lot about this. I have lots of opinions about that. I actually wrote a whole thesis about SaaS. So I was really glad to have this challenge when I joined Centreon. And I have this strong opinion that SaaS and open source can have a virtuous circle indeed. And this is not necessarily the opinion that everyone has, especially at the beginning, like 10, 15 years ago, there were articles like this: is SaaS making open source irrelevant? 5 reasons why open source is superior over SaaS. and is open source software dead? You know, that kind of topics. And it's really interesting to see that people were, at that time, they were opposing open source and SaaS. They were not seeing how they could complement each other. And nowadays, we have some open source companies that are really explaining that SaaS is a good business model for them, but they're not explaining the other side of it, why it's also good for open source that they're doing SaaS. So that's what I wanted to go in more details. So if we look at open source and SaaS, I mean, obviously, I think nearly everyone here knows a bit of computer history. Internet would not exist without open source. Most of the modern computer world would not exist without open source. Open source is everywhere. So if you look at all the major cloud actors, so AWS, Google, Azure, OVH, and so on, they're all built on top of open source. If you look at any company that is offering any kind of service over the internet, well, I do not bet, but if I would probably be willing to bet that you cannot find any company that offers service over the internet without open source. So clearly open source is something that made the whole SaaS thing happen, and that is really, really obvious, okay? So far, so good. That's easy. The other side is what's a bit more difficult. So, as I was saying, lots of people think that SaaS is not good for open source, and there's been a number of events in the last few years that actually can be used to confirm that opinion. So if you look at what companies like Elastic, HashiCorp, Redis did, you know, they actually changed their licensing to be able to run their business in a way that is actually, you know, they kind of came from the SaaS world, and they became not really friendly to open source. So I'm not judging anything here, because, you know, like I care a lot about open source, but I do not know what they were facing in terms of business. Maybe there were good reasons and so on. So I'm not trying to judge. I'm just saying that the perception is that it's not always good like this. I don't think that is necessarily always the case, and I actually think that, you know, when you look at these examples, you can name a handful of them maybe. But what you do not see is all the other ones that you do not name, hundreds, thousands of them, where you have companies, open source companies, that are using a SaaS, open source SaaS business model, sorry, that are still contributing to open source, and we do not talk about them. And because this business model is good for them, you know, it's building value for the customers, because it really solves issues for the customers, but it's building value for the company itself, because it's a sustainable business model that really help them have recurring revenues and so on. So it's really positive. And so we do not see all of that, you know, and I strongly believe that just because there are hundreds, thousands of them, if only for that, it's already a win for open source. And I forgot about that. I'll come back to the poison letter. So let me just go there. That's one thing. But the other thing that we do not talk about is that SaaS is actually offering value that is not software. And you have a lot of companies that are offering SaaS solutions that are actually releasing code because, you know, that's not their value. The value is what they're doing with the code. And there you need to think about not just B2B SaaS companies, but you can also think about companies like Netflix, Facebook, well, Meta now, and so on, that release a lot of components so that everybody is using. So if you think about React, if you think about well, Kubernetes and so on. I mean, you have tons of free software, open source solutions that came from companies that are built on a SaaS model. And that would not be possible if these companies were not running a SaaS model. And basically what they did is contribute to open source in a way that, that they would not have done if the business was selling the solution itself, the product, the code, because the value would have been the code. Now the value is what they're providing the customers with, which is a service, and this service is actually what is expensive about it is not just the code itself, but how to operate the code, all the infrastructure around that, and so on. And this is really something that makes a big difference. And I really believe strongly that there are lots of open source projects that wouldn't exist without all of that now. So back to the poison. If I can go back, yes. Why did I put that? Some people, I wanted to cover that, but I will not go in details. Some people think that there's a way to solve this this issue of people relicensing the solutions, like to help prevent companies like what happened with Elastic, Redis, and HashiCorp. And some people think that the right way to do that is to push for a licensing model that is more like AGPL with the viral side of things. I will not go in details in that because I don't think that's the topic today. But this is really something that reminds me of basically the open source versus free software debate that will never end. I'm happy to talk about that with anyone for a few hours if you want, because I have strong opinions about that. But I don't think it's relevant at the end of the day. I don't think that's the main topic. I think the license, if it was viral or not, would not change anything. What was really important is basically what the people wanted to do, what the people running the companies wanted to do, what kind of pressure they had to deal with, and so on. And you could have put any license. I mean, they would have changed. They would have found a way to do something different. I don't think that's the right solution, to be honest. But so, no opinion again. I mean, that's not the big topic here, but I wanted to mention that. Now, we have this virtuous circle here. I think it works really well, but it's actually not so easy. I said it before. First, it does rely on the people wanting to do the right thing. If you do not have people in the companies willing to do the right thing, then who knows what happens. And that kind of goes back to the talk from Thierry about single vendor, open source, and so on. So that's one thing. The other thing that is really important is that actually doing SaaS correctly and running a business with SaaS is not so trivial. It's very difficult. I mean, within Centreon, we're right into it. It's a big transition and so on. It is expensive in terms of investments that you need to do and so on. So it is really difficult to do that, and not everyone can do it. So this virtuous circle in both directions needs a lot of efforts. It needs people willing to do that. It needs people willing to commit to it. And yeah, that's far from trivial, but I do think that it works really well. Now, what I've described here, I think it works really well for B2B in terms of an open source company. So an open source company is selling a solution to other companies. That works fine. Okay, I mean, it's difficult, but I think it works fine. For B2C, I must admit that I'm not so sure that it's as valid. I don't know. I don't think that there's a lot of open source companies that are successful selling to end users directly. This is not related to SaaS, actually, in my opinion. I think it's more related to how the open source world has evolved. If you look at it today, and if you look at it like 20 years ago, it has clearly shifted. And I mean, from my own experience, that's also the case. Like 20 years ago, when I was working on open source, I was really doing things that was focused on the end users. I was working on desktops, so really how you use your computer directly. And this focus has really moved, and now all the industry has moved towards the business side of things. Again, is it good? I don't know, but from that perspective of a virtuous circle between open source and SaaS, I think that it's much more difficult to do that when you're targeting B2C. Now, that's it, basically. I wanted to end with that nice hurt, because, I like when we all share some love. And for me, that's the end note. Open source and SaaS, that's really positive. I want everyone to be convinced about that. I want to make sure that we're not thinking that because there's one or the other company that is breaking this circle by breaking some trust, we stop thinking about this in a positive way. I think it's really positive. I think we should all think about this in this way, and I hope I helped convince some of you. Thank you.